Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Veterinary Business Podcast, your ultimate resource for developing a successful veterinary practice and career. I'm Dr. Peter Weinstein, one of the co-hosts of the Veterinary Business Podcast. On this podcast, we bring you insights and expertise from industry-leading doctors, experts, and thought leaders. We cover a wide range of topics, including practice management, marketing strategies, leadership development, HR best practices, and much more. So, whether you're a practicing veterinarian, a practice owner, a practice manager, or a veterinary student who wants to be a practice owner or a practice manager, this podcast is tailored to help you navigate the unique challenges and opportunities in the business of veterinary medicine. Every listener of the podcast is welcome to visit www.veterinarybusinessinstitute.com for additional resources and tools to support your growth. And remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and all of those ever-present popular podcast platforms. Today, I am so excited to welcome a good friend, Melisa Edwards. She's president of Evolve Practice Transitions, and our topic stems from a conversation we had, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And the topic we're going to use today is, where have all the profits gone? And that's the PROFITS, although we could probably use the synonym for profits too in this case. But before we get into depth, I really need Melisa to kind of take a minute and tell us about how you got into the veterinary field. Now, we've known each other for well over a decade, and I remember you in the good old days when it was Bank of America, but I don't think we've ever delved into how you got into the veterinary field.
And you know what? I'm going to correct you, Peter. We've almost known each other for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
It's very, very close to that. I don't know where the time has gone. Time flies when we're having fun, right?
Right.
How did I get into the vet field? So I was a young finance slinger of money. And I had been roped into this small niche company that specialized in dental primarily, but also dabbled in veterinary and human medical loans. And during my tenure there, I developed a number of referral relationships, mainly on the West Coast, that were veterinary specific, and I took a liking to them. I'm an animal lover. I have veterinary friends, and it was something that we weren't doing enough of. And I was a part of really developing the platform for a veterinary specific finance unit within Bank of America. And that was back in 2007, and it has flourished, and I think that they're still very, very successful in that business unit. But I left the bank in 2015 to start my own brokerage firm, really specializing in the acquisitions side of the business. And that's where I remain today, having a good time with buyers and sellers.
So we probably met in 2007, 2008 when I took over at SCVMA.
Yeah.
And you were just putting together the veterinary specific arm of the Bank of America veterinary lending. You and your other M, Marissa, give a big shout out to Marissa Martinez. We became friends, and we became focused on helping young doctors, because I remember you made a huge commitment to helping young doctors understand what it's like to be an entrepreneur, what it's like to be in business. And you help support many meetings, dozens of meetings for what we called back then the DVM2K group, which was those who were graduated right around 2000. Now we'd have to call it the DVM2KXX or something like that, because we'd be 2020 by now. But what what I was really happy about is when you moved from B of A, I wasn't happy about that, but when you moved from B of A, your focus was on helping create young entrepreneurs and helping initially, correct me if I'm wrong, your original focus was on helping the buyers.
Yeah, I know what I had noticed from working at Bank of America on the lending side is sellers always had an advocate in brokers, but there's nobody really focused on helping the buyers and advocating from their position. The buyers really couldn't afford, that advocacy. And what I was noticing is they were hiring attorneys, and whether the deal went through or not, they were having to pay their attorneys. And so I wanted to level the playing field a lot. That was, and it still is a passion of mine. I do the seller side as well, but the buyers really needed somebody to hold their hands and look through the numbers and teach them how to look at the numbers. And I know that you've done quite a bit of that also with the Veterinary Business Institute, and also all of your different organizations that you're involved in. But I think, veterinarians are so used to being the expert in the room. And when they're confronted with, financial data, and they've never seen a P&L before, they've never seen a business tax return before, it looks like hieroglyphics. And so I enjoy taking them through and showing them really the simplicity of those financials and getting comfortable with that so that they can take control of their destiny, right? If they want to be an owner, and, I'm a huge advocate of veterinary ownership. If they want to be an owner, you've got to understand those numbers and what they mean to you as an owner, and as a business person, and sometimes, and someday that's going to become a seller. So you need to understand what the value of your business is.
So since you play both sides of the aisle, you gave me a call a couple of weeks ago, sent me an email. I don't recall what it was, but we did have a conversation because you were disturbed. We know you were disturbed, but you were disturbed about a trend that you were seeing. You were disturbed by a trend that you were seeing. And one of the services that you provide is practice appraisals to help both the buyers and sellers get a fair, unbiased valuation of the practice for finance purposes, purchase purposes, et cetera. And you had done about a dozen appraisals in a row of sellers seeking to sell, and all of them had profitabilities in the single digit range, below 10%.
Yep.
And we use the term profitability, we use the term EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Can I buy a vowel? And I'm going to use, if we don't mind, I'm going to use them synonymously in our conversations because we don't have time to get into the defined differences between the two. But you had 12 practices in a row with profitabilities less than 10%, which means the owners they owned a job, not a business. They weren't getting sufficient return from a business owner standpoint. And you said to me, where have all the profits gone? Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that a trend that you had been seeing when we spoke not that long ago?
Yeah, this year, it really has just been one after another. We've had a couple of pretty healthy practices, but I would say by and large, and this isn't just regional, this is throughout the country. And I'm seeing 5, 6, 7% profit. And when you talked about buying a job, what's interesting is what I'm also seeing is where the owners are paying for this lack of profitability. I'll let you guess. How do you think they're paying for that?
How do I think from a long-term standpoint, they're paying for it in return on investment. They're paying for it in what they are not going to get towards their retirement.
That's true. And they're doing it in the short term, they're taking it away from their owner's compensation.
Right.
So they're working just as hard as they've ever worked, right? And their owner's compensation is going down so that they can pay for, and I don't know if it's, an overstaffed situation, if it's an overpayment situation, and an underproductivity situation, right? And that's why I called you, because I can see the problems. I just don't know how to fix it, right?
So let's talk about trends a little bit before we get into diagnosing of the problem. Because if we look at a financial statement, I look at a financial statement as the lab work for a business. The business is the animal,
Mhm.
and the income statement is the lab work, and it tells us about the health of the animal. And
Mhm.
so before this trend that you just saw, this recent trend, can you think back and to see on average what was kind of the average profitabilities maybe pre-pandemic, and then through the pandemic, where some of the I'm sure you were involved with some transactions that had huge multipliers, and then post-pandemic. So let's look at a little bit of trending. Pre-pandemic, what kind of was the average, if you have an idea, for the profitabilities of the practices you were appraising?
I'd say between 10 and 12% was pretty average.
Okay.
And these are independent doctor practices, typically below $2.5 million in revenue. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what I did notice, and I looked back, I had a feeling you were going to ask this question. And I looked back on the trends pre and post pandemic, and we really saw a crescendo of profitability in 2021. And this is, I when I do evaluation, I look at the last 3 years. So I'm still looking at 2021, right? And then I'm seeing the cliff in 2022 and 2023 and mid-year 2024. So that was really the peak, right? And I think that a lot of that had to do with the way that we were receiving our patients, right, in veterinary medicine, right? Maybe we didn't have to have the same staff from a receptionist perspective. So maybe there was some understaffing going on, which allowed that profitability to be where it was. But then, right around the end of the pandemic and still into 2024, we're seeing labor rates 10 to 20% higher than they were pre-pandemic, right? And that's not just in the veterinary industry, right? That's everywhere. That's inflationary, right? But what I'm asking my doctors is, you're paying people more, which is fantastic. I fully support that. But are you asking them to do, I don't even know if it's more, but are they aware of how much it costs just to keep those doors open? And do we have a team approach to make sure that we're paying the bills and it's not coming out of the owner's paycheck, right? And understand that pre-pandemic, the owners weren't making millions of dollars, right? They were making a very middle class income, as you know. So we're not talking about, millionaires floating around with their riches. And so, what I'm seeing is doctors, owners working, 60 hours a week, busting their tail, and they're not paying themselves appropriately for all of their production and management.
It is a painful conversation, but what's even more painful, if I look at it globally, is when you tell me your average practices, independent, was 10 to 12%, and these are the slightly above sized practices in the sense that most of them were 2.5 million or below, I think you told me, in terms of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
according to the AVMA, the average American veterinary hospital has 2.2 doctors doing 1.2 million. And so when you tell, and according to just talks within the industry, that what we call no value or low value price point is right at that 10 to 12%. So we have a lot of practices that are average. Now, it's great when you're average, except when you go to sell, because, correct me if I'm wrong, the corporate buyers, but not only the corporate buyers, but the educated buyers are looking for above average. They're looking for a good ROI so that they can step in and not have to work so hard. So what would you suggest, in your opinion, is maybe the sweet spot that the national corporations are looking at? And is there a difference between the sweet spot that the national corporations are looking at and the sweet spot that an educated buyer is looking at?
So I think 15% is what I'd love to see. I've seen that twice this year in the valuations that I've done. But also understand that when a corporation looks at your numbers, they're looking at all of the expenses paid, including your own production. And so what I'm seeing in these owners undervaluing their own production compensation, if a corporate buyer were to come in and take a look at that, they're going to adjust that, because that's not going to be sustainable going forward, whether that's continuing to pay the owner for their production or another associate moving forward, right? So they're still going to take that hit when it comes to the valuation process. Now, a new owner coming in and stepping into that seller's shoes most likely will be able to take on that production role. So there may be even a lift from an independent sale that you would not get from a corporate sale. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Because that compensation is then going to them. But that's not part of a true business valuation. A business valuation has to do with what is left over after you've paid for everyone, including the owner's production. And if the owner is producing, 5, 6, 7, I talked to an owner that was doing $1.7 million last month, and they were not compensating themselves appropriately for that production.
So let's dissect the bigger picture. Let's take a look at the lab work. Okay, so there are really what I would suggest 4 major expenses, 3 huge and 1 smaller. Staff salaries, doctor salaries, products, cost of goods, and then overhead, rent, mortgage, etc. So those 4 will take about 65% or so of the revenue in a well-managed practice. Is that what you look at as well?
That's accurate.
Okay. So if we look at that, and then we look at, you've got about 35% left to cover everything else, including your return on investment. And let's just say we want 15% ROI. That means you really have 20% for all of the little blood-sucking leeches out there called, merchant services and internet and paper and everything else, which means really to get that 20%, you got to work, or you have to be efficient in your utilization of your physical plant, your people, your products, etc. Fair enough?
Fair.
Okay. So 2021, veterinary practices were busier, quote unquote, than they had ever been. Pandemic hit March of 2020. I was flying back from Portland. I had just seen my daughter up in Corvallis. The airport was empty. Come back to Orange County, they shut it down. And for the next couple of months, life was scary. Nobody moved, and we thought the end of the world was coming. About June of 2020, all of a sudden the floodgates opened. We got curbside figured out. Things opened up a little bit, and veterinary practices got super busy. Now, while we were super busy, we actually lost a lot of staff members for various reasons, some stress, some health, some other things. So here we are, revenue is up, cost of staff is going down, and we're continuing to plug along. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, whether it's out of nowhere or planned, I can't say, salaries started to escalate dramatically. And veterinary salaries escalated because we started to see a need to fill with new doctors. But the supply of doctors, which was already compromised, wasn't getting any fuller. So when supply goes down and demand goes up, the cost for acquisition goes up. How's my economics 101 there?
Fantastic. It's like you've been working with a university.
I know. Hard to fathom that. So salaries went up. Concurrently, we had a difficult time hiring and retaining good people. And minimum wage was going up. So staff costs went up. Concurrently, we actually raised fees. So staff salaries go up, doctor salaries go up. That's not a good thing for profits. So what do you do to make up for the gap? You increase your fees.
Okay, but here is what I am seeing. I am seeing that we did not raise fees appropriately, timely. We raised some and not others to keep up with, cost of goods and so on and so forth. So that is a lagging metric, because also our veterinarian owners are human beings, and they look at their clients going through inflationary times, and they try to x-ray their wallet, and they're not raising prices appropriately because they feel bad.
So before we get into the fee side of things, I want to continue on that expense side, because if you wanted to hit the perfect storm, we had supply chain issues. And now all of our cost of goods went up as well. So we got hit by three whammies. Staff salaries went up, doctor salaries went up, cost of goods went up, all the utilities and everything else got more expensive from an inflationary standpoint. So our profitabilities all started to take a hit. And this isn't just in the independent practices, this was in the corporate practices as well. And those practices in 2021 who were able to manage well and had a good 2020 and 2019 were all Pac-Maned up by national corporations at huge multipliers. I mean, I've heard anywhere from 24 to 28 at the highest for some hospitals. So before we get into the revenue side and the cost side, does that all jive with what you were seeing in that time frame as well?
100%. Yeah.
And so here we are, we've got huge multipliers. So the more profitable practices with higher profitabilities and EBITDAs went off the marketplace. And that kind of tilts the leans the averages down a little bit because you're taking some of the better ones off. Mm-hmm. And then fees started to go up. Fees were raised to deal with the gap that was created by the expenses. And whether they were raised appropriately or sufficiently, it was okay when people weren't vacationing, weren't traveling, and were sitting at home with their pets, looking at them, watching them, thinking that they were sick because they were having a dream and twitching. And
that was all of their expendable income, and they were okay with it.
Absolutely. So veterinarians were riding a wave, a gold wave, for maybe 2020 through 2022, maybe late 22. That makes sense with you as well?
Yeah, and people were sitting at home looking at Fluffy thinking, God, I think Fluffy has a cold. Let's go see a human being.
Right. Right. And then things opened up. Discretion, the government stopped sending money out. And airplanes opened up and Disneyland opened up and everybody started to spend their discretionary income, and it wasn't on pets. And now, for the last 2 years, not only have we seen our costs go up, but nationally, the trends have also seen the number of visits have gone down.
Sure.
And are you seeing that trend in looking at the hospitals you're talking to as well?
Yeah, specifically in new client numbers. Yes.
Right. So to make up for seeing fewer people, you have to charge more to get the same revenue. You either do it on earns or turns, right? More per person or see more people. And now we're getting pushback because the cost of care all of a sudden has become more of a burden to pet owners. Talk about the imperfect storm, right? Everything on the expense side is going up. The revenue side all of a sudden is getting choked. And how high can you raise your fees before clients stop coming in? And I don't want to blame the national economy on this. I don't want to blame the veterinary economy on this, but I will say that inflation in the veterinary field has been twice the level of inflation in the national consumer price index. Have you seen some of that with the fees that you've seen from practices?
I have, and also I think that they were underpriced before. So I think that there's a little bit of leveling the playing field also just at a bad time, right?
Right. Yeah, the imperfect storm. And so when we have the national corporations and the private companies all trying to survive with a smaller pool of people, skilled people, and or smaller pool of people in general, let's talk about salaries. And let's talk about non-veterinary salaries to begin with. Now, I'm in the People's Republic of California, and our minimum wage is, at least in the LA area, is approaching $17 an hour. However, recent reports indicate that to be able to live as an individual in LA and Orange County, you need to be earning $55,000 a year, which is essentially $28 per hour. So all of these moving parts, inflation, minimum wage, take a hit in all of the service industries. So correct me if I'm wrong, but not just veterinary medicine, but virtually all service industries are having a difficult time keeping up with the economics of people.
That is correct. Yeah. We're not seeing the inflow, right, from a revenue standpoint, to keep up with it, right, at the levels that we would like to see if we're dealing with hospital management operations historically. So something has to change.
Right. How do we get more productivity out of our people? And I think you asked that question a little bit earlier. How do we get more productivity out of our people? I mean, how do we turn the tables at the restaurant? How do we get more people on airplanes? How do we get more people in hotel rooms? How do we get more clients into veterinary hospitals paying for the services? And I would suggest that the cost of airlines, restaurants, hotels, movies, Disneyland have all gone up all at the same time.
Yep.
Would that be a sufficient explanation for some of the financial statements you've looked at?
I think that is I would say that labor is the biggest driver. I know that, drugs and supplies have gone up. And that's standard. We're used to that on a semi-annual basis, right? But labor is what's really killing us. Yeah.
So if I'm a veterinary seller and you look at my P&L and you look at the numbers that are benchmarks for the industry. Let's start with, what do you suggest from a range standpoint of a good, well-managed practices for the percentage of revenue being paid just W-2 salaries to the non-professional staff?
So typically we see that between 18 and 22%.
Two thumbs up. I agree 100%. Okay, let's do the same thing on cost of goods. What's the percentage you suggest on cost of goods in a well-managed practice?
I mean, I would like them to target 18%.
Okay.
I think, and I don't think that that's taking away from inventory. I think that that's sufficient.
Okay.
I just saw one recently, actually. It was a startup. This is a tangent, but they wanted a valuation done after their first year, which I thought was extraordinary. Their costs of goods were at 8%. Online
Wow.
pharmacy. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll talk about online pharmacy in just a minute.
Okay.
Okay, so the final of the big three is doctors. Now, let's talk doctors, because I need this to be crystal clear. If I'm looking at a practice, I want to know what the salaries only are as a percentage of revenue, not the doctor owner takes home this amount, but what do you budget, suggest, or look for from a doctor's salary, whether it's a 10-doctor practice, general practice, not specialty, or a 1-doctor practice?
So what I would like to see, or what is out there right now in the marketplace.
Yes.
What I would like to see is probably another 12 to 15% in doctors' salaries, right?
So if I'm a doctor owner and I'm paying on production, I'm paying on average between 18 and 22% of production. If I'm an owner, theoretically, and this is what I suggest owners do, they should pay themselves as they pay their associates.
Correct. Yes.
And then they should write 3 other checks during the month to themselves. One for management, which goes in a separate line item, one for rent or mortgage if they own the building, and one for ROI. So that they are separating out their income into 4 buckets as an owner, because this way you can truly look at doctor production. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
No, I like that. I think that you should be compensated for all of the hats that you wear, right? As a landlord, as a manager, as a producer.
So do you really think the doctor production is at 15%?
I mean, you just threw out 22% as a production. I mean, I'm seeing 25%.
Yeah.
And that's, they're competing, right, against the corporations, right, who have been, raising the production expectation.
Very generous, haven't they? Makes it very hard to compete.
Yeah.
And so if we were to take and extrapolate the conversation, because of competition, because of economics, the 3 major bloodsuckers, staffs out, don't wait a second, I'm going to say this and it's going to sound all wrong. The 3 major expenses, staff salary, doctor salary, cost of goods, have gotten out of control relative to revenue. Now, revenue has gotten out of control relative to consumer affordability. Mm-hmm. Would you say we're in a very challenging time from a big picture standpoint?
For sure. We've got to figure out how to grow and continue to grow sustainably. And that's by new clients, not necessarily price increases, right? And we've got to utilize our staff better. We've got to actually utilize what you're paying yourself from a management perspective, right? How are we managing people and expecting output from them? And that's not a bad word. When I have these conversations, when I do the valuation conversation and I talk to them about profit, and I would say, 9 times out of 10, they want to whisper that word, right? And I want to shake my veterinary clients and say, look, if you're a business owner, profit is not a bad word. Profit is necessary to the health of your business.
You know, I need you to make T-shirts for veterinarians that says profit is not a bad word, or tattoo it on their wrist. So every time they look at their hands as they're scrubbing for surgery, profit is not a bad word, because it's not. So I want you to think about this, and we probably have had this conversation. Every veterinary practice for whom you work has 2 clients. Now, if they only have 2 clients, they're probably not very profitable, except if you look at it a global scheme of things. Profit client number 1 is the client you see every day. They are the ones that you have to take care of, and their pets, to the best level, highest quality that you can, so that they will give you the highest return on that visit, which isn't about trying to make ground beef out of the cow. It's about building relationships and looking at the long-term value of that client to your practice. In other words, we should be looking at clients as a long-term investment, not as a single transaction.
It's not transactional. It is a relationship.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it's a relationship. And if we take care of that client number 1 and all of the other clients that they refer in and friends and family, over the next 20 to 25 years, they will take care of client number 2, who is absolutely your exit strategy, whatever they may be. And if you do that, the profits will be there just by building relationships, taking good care of your clients, and not letting them go somewhere else. So, in my opinion, we don't have a client acquisition problem. We have a client retention problem. We don't have a staff acquisition problem. We have a staff retention problem, and the same thing for doctors. So we know that the cost of acquiring a new staff member, a new doctor, and a new client are much more expensive than keeping them, don't we?
100%. Yep.
So if we focused on the top 1,000 clients, the top 50% of our clients, we'd probably have great profitability. And if we keep our staff, we'd probably have great profitability if we encourage them to work to the top of their job description, optimize all of the skills and training that we provide for them. Oh, that's assuming we provide training. And then the same thing with doctors. What can we do to encourage them to be long-term members of our team? So what do you think of that logic? Let's focus on keeping people, all of them, from womb to tomb, so that they actually give us the greatest return they possibly can.
I think that is the name of the game, right? How do we do that, Peter?
Well, we need profits, PROPHETS, to talk about profits, PROFITS, as a good thing. And I'm all about profit sharing as well. So I'm going to digress for just a minute. What are your thoughts about profit sharing, ESOPs, and all sorts of other business models that encourage the staff to have a greater voice in the ultimate outcomes?
Yeah, and I think it's transparency, right? And I think that opening up the books and letting your team know, look, this is how much we have to make on a daily basis, right? In order to maintain the staff and the culture that we have right now. It's inherent in all of us to do what we can do to reach that goal. And actually, if we exceed it, we're all going to share in that success. I think that is the only way forward.
So, what we've got in many cases is hospital staff who can't afford the cost of veterinary care for their own pets in the hospital at which they work.
Mhm.
And they have a hard time wrapping their arms around that value proposition. But when they're an owner and some of it drops down to them, I'm not suggesting that they're going to be out there gouging, but I am suggesting that the work that they do gives them a higher return. And so what we're talking about here in a very challenging economic environment is how do we get the best people? How do we keep the best people? And how do we get them to focus on the number one client, the one we're seeing each day, every day, for the length of time that we need? Because, I mean, there was this statistic, and I'm sure you've quoted it as well, that 50% of your clients, no matter what business, give you about 90 to 95% of your profits.
Mhm.
You've heard that too?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've also utilized the 80-20 rule, right?
Right.
So whatever that split is, yeah, I'm sure you've got some dead weights in every business, and you spend 80% of your time focusing on 20% of your business, but that's not the right people that we should be focused on. And you could say that about your staff as well, right?
So if 20% of our clients gave us 80% of our profits, could we get by with fewer people? Do we need to have the same number of clients all the time? I mean, and I do a number of talks, as you know, on productivity efficiencies. And in your opinion, in looking at valuations, are practices efficiently utilizing the entire square footage that they are paying rent or mortgage on?
No, I mean, I would say that productivity and efficiency is probably where we need to put our resources, right? And that's not just in the facility, but also in tech utilization, right? As you've talked about before. And I want to say, was it the AVMA that just brought forth some data, and they're trying to push forward nationally some expanded duties for techs. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I know that California VMA has, and AVMA has, and AHA has done a recent report on tech utilization. I think that if we want to be able to leverage our doctors so that they are focusing on where they are most financially productive, there are only three things doctors have to do: diagnose, prescribe, and do surgery. So when they are tangential to those three things, then they are not optimizing their salaries, for lack of a way to put it. Those three things allow for you to delegate to credentialed technicians those skills that they are allowed to do based upon the Practice Act in your state. And there are different states out there who have different recommendations and requirements. So if we can then optimize doctor focus, optimize credentialed technician focus, that now leaves virtually everything else as the wild, wild west that everybody else on the team can contribute to. And so by leveraging your team, by learning to delegate, and by learning to charge for the services that your team is providing, because we haven't done that in the past. Mm-hmm. Now, all of a sudden, you have income streams that hadn't been identified, and you're creating, correct me if I'm wrong, you're creating greater efficiencies with the utilization of your team. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm hearing from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's necessary. And I know that most of my veterinary clients, just I guess they get worried that they're placing too much stress on their techs. And instead of actually focusing on development, right, and delegation, they're trying to keep everything with, the DVMs on staff. And I look back in my time in the dental world, 30 to 45% of revenue generation is from the hygienist staff, right? And that is an extremely profitable cost center or revenue center, right? And I just feel like, and you would be the one to actually, talk about the implementation of it, that the certified and registered techs on the staff, and if you don't have those, making sure that you're developing them, right? Sometimes we can't hire. Sometimes we do need to mentor and develop. And frankly, that's what people want anyway, is that development. And so the difference between paying 22% and 25% is mentorship, right? And development. But that's the staff that we really need to lean on here, right?
So the difference between paying 22 and 25% is paying the staff the same amount in a hard number, but having them generate greater revenue, because there's a denominator and a numerator when calculating a percentage.
Yeah.
We don't always remember that. And so the ways to play with percentages are both the denominator and the numerator. When you do both of them, that's when you optimize your profitability. So if you can keep the salaries the same and the productivity and efficiency goes up, your profitability goes up. And that's with your physical plant, that's with your people, leveraging them. And you mentioned earlier cost of goods, and that you have a practice at 8% cost of goods on the expense side. The cost of goods is also one of the top revenue side. How were they able
but revenue without profitability, and I talk about this too many times this year, right? Revenue without profitability means nothing.
Absolutely. We have a lot of, again, we have a lot of businesses that are jobs because they're able to generate revenue, but they're not able to generate profitability. Now, the pharmacy is an area that has been a huge, huge profit center. But have you seen practices that have been able to move a little bit more to the online and still retain the profitability?
Absolutely, because they don't have that expense on the shelves, right?
So they're managing their online pharmacies to return a sufficient profitability, so they don't need to keep it in stock, but they can get the same net by using their online pharmacies. Is that what I'm hearing?
Correct. But really, that is a convenience factor for your clients. You're just not going to get enough profitability from inventory sales to make a difference, right? So it's about convenience and making sure that your clients can access that. But that's not where you're going to be spending a ton of your time thinking about growing your business, right? You're going to grow it through services.
So there's a mindset change there, because if you go back pre all this competition for online pharmacies, we really were about the pharmacy as a profit center. And that's a PROFIT center from the PROPHETs. The profits, we're all talking about the pharmacy as a profit center. But now we're talking about, can we sustain the pharmacy as a profit center in the face of all of this competition? And what I'm hearing is, in a well-managed practice where you have minimized your brick and mortar pharmacy, you can make up for it with a well-managed and thought through online pharmacy to meet the needs of the current generations of pet owners. Is that your messaging?
That's accurate. Yeah.
All right. So we have all of these hospitals that you just did audits and appraisals for. They're all lacking in oxygen. In fact, when you call them, you probably had to have whatever beverage you need to make that phone call to tell them that their practices were not going to return to them what they expected. So what does that phone call sound like?
Well, that is the worst conversation that I have and what I do, and I think about going back to banking frequently. That's not. But I always imagine it's similar to diagnosing cancer in a patient, right? So that conversation, which is not one that I want to have, right? The great thing is if I get to have that conversation 5 years plus before they need to do something about it, right? If we can have that wake up conversation when they can actually make some changes in their practice, right? If I'm having that conversation and they want to sell in 6 months, is a very, very difficult hour, and it requires some brown liquor. Yeah.
So there's a couple of messages in there. Number one, getting an appraisal at a regular intervals, whether you're going to sell or not, will give you, and it's like, let's call it doing wellness lab work on a pet. It's like getting an assessment of the status of your business or the status of a pet by doing an appraisal that will tell you what values are out of whack. And then if you called me and said, okay, I know you're not ready to sell, but your profitability could use some work. My questions then to you are, which areas do I need to work on, and how do I go about doing that? Is that what it sounds like on the other side of the phone?
Yep. And that is exactly why I reached out to you. I said, look, here is just what I'm seeing. I can see the problems, but I've never worked in a veterinary hospital. Please help me help them, Peter.
Right. Well, we talked about some of that today with focusing on basically the 4 major cost categories: staff costs, doctor costs, cost of goods, and overhead. And we talked about efficiency and productivity. And that really, it's much easier to get ahead of cancer early than when it's at the later stages. So there's the other phone call. That is the veterinarian who, for whatever reason, needs to sell yesterday, wants to sell yesterday. And they come to you and you do their appraisal and you say, well, doc, where have you been stashing the cash? Because there's not a lot of value in the numbers that you've shared with me.
Can we talk about that just real fast though too?
I have one. That's where I want to go next. Yes.
Okay. So if we are, and I'm not saying that anybody's doing this, I'm not saying that they're not doing this, but if you are not reporting your cash, and I cannot see that on your tax return, a buyer and their bank or their investor also will not be able to see that or reflect that in your value, right? So you either report all of your income and you pay taxes on it, and your value is what you would expect, or you enjoy that cash and make sure that you've tucked all of that away, because that is not going to have any bearing on your final sales price.
So I know you're not a financial advisor, but you've been in the banking industry and you know about investments. What is the interest rate paid by a Tempur-Pedic?
The interest rate paid by a Tempur-Pedic.
In other words, if you put your cash in the mattress, how much you're going to get as a return?
I got it. I just remembered one of your students from last year. That would be 0.
So what you're saying is, if you're stashing cash and you're not investing it, then you're getting no return. if you're stashing cash and you are investing it, then you run the risk on an audit basis of having that come up as a problem. So the best way to do things is to be honest and above board and report your income. All of it.
All of it.
All of it. So I've heard stories from accountants or others similar who have similar work that you do of veterinarians actually having made copies of the cash and have 3-ring binders of copies of the cash that they have taken but not reported. Have you had that experience?
Something similar. Yes, absolutely. I think it also comes back to when you sell your practice, goodwill is 90% of the value of your business. And that has to do with your ethics and your honesty. And, when a buyer looks at that behavior, they're going to wonder, how else have you cut corners?
This is fun for us, but not fun for everybody who's going to be listening to this. We have about 35,000 or so veterinary hospitals in the country. About 25% are owned by national corporations, so about 8,000, which leaves about 25,000, let's just for round numbers, about 25,000 independently owned hospitals that are out there. At some point in time, virtually all of them are going to want to sell. Some of them maybe just started and they're not thinking about client number 2 quite yet. But from a statistic, I believe, reported by AVMA, 30% of those independently owned hospitals are owned by baby boomers, which means they're my age and older. What advice would you give them today? It's July, whatever it is, 2024. What advice would you give them today, so that they will get the greatest return on the sale of their lifetime commitment?
I would say get your valuation done before you need it done. I would say look at how you're paying yourself. Are you paying yourself an appropriate compensation for your production and for your management? Because when you cut corners, we're still going to see that in the final valuation number, because that is still an expense that is going to need to be shored up going forward post-transition, right? So just a lot of times we see the profit line of your tax return and we hold our hats on that. And then I dig a little bit deeper and, you're not paying yourself for your production or your management. And maybe you own the building and you aren't charging yourself an appropriate fair market value rent. All of those things, when it comes to your valuation, are going to have to be normalized. So don't do yourself a disservice by cutting corners just to increase that number, because a buyer is gonna come in and their advisors are gonna make those adjustments for you. So, take your blinders off and let's see where you're really at. And that way we can tackle, the next step. Hopefully we have time to do that. And people like yourself, Peter, and some of your colleagues can help in that productivity.
So what you're saying is, if you have lab work done and it identifies a problem, it would behoove you to get a second opinion from a specialist that can help you address those problems. And I'm going to unashamedly suggest you go to vetpartners.org, which is the national group of consultants, and try to identify a consultant who can help you deal with numbers that might be askew from that standpoint. Melisa is a great resource resource as a generalist to help you identify where the problems are, but your success team are the ones who can help you treat that problem and make your business healthier.
And not just in raising prices.
Right.
That is a component of it. And you want to make sure that your prices make sense and they're competitive, with your market. But, I see a lot of times that's the solution. It really has to do with staff utilization, I think, in operations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's efficiencies, it's effectiveness, it's ultimate productivity, and it's utilizing your staff to the top of their skill set from that standpoint. A couple of quick final questions. What are you telling buyers these days? I know you, like I, am very excited about the opportunities for entrepreneurship. What's the marketplace look like for buyers these days? It's in light of the changes in multipliers and the valuations that you're seeing. What's the message for buyers?
Well, I think, in the last couple of years when, the corporations, there was a fever to buy practices, a lot of that has died down. And this is the renaissance of independent practice ownership. I would say, even though rates are higher than they were, you and I are old enough to know that rates have been historically much higher. I would say anything below an 8% is actually historically a fair fixed rate. So don't worry about rates. You want to make sure that you pay a fair price for the practice that you're looking at. But I think that you have an opportunity to compete for some of the best hospitals out there in a way that you have not had an opportunity to do in the last 5 years, which I think is very exciting.
Outstanding. And as a advocate for the buyers and the sellers, and an advocate for helping them find resources, everybody needs a success team. Mm-hmm. So who should both buyers and sellers have besides you on their success team?
Well, you're going to need an attorney either way. And they don't necessarily have to be veterinary specific. You want to make sure that they've done transactions, right? Contract lawyers. You'd always ask, have you ever worked with a veterinarian or a dentist before? You're going to need a CPA. Again, I don't think that you necessarily need a veterinary specific CPA. I think that they just need to, be honest and communicate appropriately, and understand business tax returns, right? A good consultant like Peter, who's actually been in the trenches, and there's very few that are as good and honest and ethical as Peter. Financial advisors, I always talk to my sellers. Look, we can do valuations and we can make a plan, but if we don't know what that target is, we really have, we don't know when we're done, right? When are we ready to sell? Well, that's when you have what you need, from a value perspective in your practice to go ahead and retire, and do what you want in that retirement, right? So it's nice to have that target, and they'll be able to look at all of your assets and your liabilities personally and professionally and help make a plan.
Well, Melisa, we could go on and on and on, but how can the listeners find you if they have questions or want some assistance in the world of veterinary hospital transactions? What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
You just go to my website at www.myvetbroker.com, and you can get all of my contact information there.
And I will say that Melisa is very responsive when people reach out to her. Well, I want to thank Pete Seeger for allowing us to sing "Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Where Have All the Profits Gone?" Excuse me. I want to thank Melisa Edwards for joining us. I want to thank her for her friendship and support of the veterinary profession as well. So thank you, Melisa.
Thank you, Peter.
We appreciate all you do. I want to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you as well. We can't do this without you. If we did it, who would be listening to us? Also, please don't forget to share our podcast with your colleagues and friends on social media. Don't forget to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, whatever that may be. Your reviews will encourage others to come and listen and help find us, because we truly do want to help influence the next generation of veterinary owners and the whole profession. So until next time, keep striving for excellence and making a positive impact in the lives of your patients and pet parents. I wish you all an amazing week ahead.